This lesson on Lamentations is going to be very short because it only has 5 chapters and it's mostly poetry. The author is unknown, but there's good reason to presume it was Jeremiah. It was read on the annual fast for Jerusalem's destructions from as far back as anyone can remember, according to the commentary. And you'll notice also, by the way, in the description, I've changed the link to just show what I'm showing here on screen rather than having you go just to Constable's commentary. Anyway, the hope of that was that in future generations, the Hebrews would not repeat the wickedness of their ancestors by repeating these laments every year. But, of course, that isn't how it worked out. And the 5 chapters are 5 separate laments or dirges. So this is not a happy, feel-good book at all, but there are a couple of lessons in it for us, so we're just going to go real briefly over this. In chapter 1, it uses the analogy of a betrayed and abandoned woman for Jerusalem, who is described as a once prominent and delicate lady whose friends and lovers have all forsaken her. The nation of Judah had chased after any and every nation that offered hope of escape from the wrath of God that, as we know in the lesson on Jeremiah, had been predicted repeatedly. But in doing so, they only earned more wrath for their efforts of trying to weasel out of it. And not only had those nations not helped, they actively sought to harm Israel. So it did them no good to try to weasel out of what was coming to them because of their sins. So now, as you can see in verse 3, the whole nation is in exile, away from the peace of God, while the promised land, their land of peace, was lying in ruins and desolation. And on top of that, down in verse 7, their enemies mock and gloat over their demise, but the nation as a whole had asked for it. Their repeated rebellion against God earned them the wages they were finally being paid, and now they were crying about it, as we often do. When things like that happen to us, we get the consequences of our actions and we cry out to God to take it away. But then we turn around and do the same thing again. In verse 9, the text goes on to describe the nation's shame in the crudest of terms, and the people knew that the reason they had to watch helplessly as their precious temple was robbed was because they had pushed God too far. We go down to verse 12, and after describing all of this in the third person as an observer, the text speaks from the nation's perspective, but they really had no right to complain, especially since on many occasions God relented from punishing them because they said they were sorry, only to go right back to their wickedness. This is just as we would describe a narcissist today, an abusive spouse who keeps saying, "Oh, I'm sorry, it won't happen again," and then eventually it turns to blaming the victim for everything the narcissist does. This is exactly how the nation was acting at that time. So you can read through the rest. Like I said, it is poetry. It's downers. That's very depressing. But I would turn your attention to chapter 3 and verse 21. If we can scroll down to that. And the reason is that after describing a life of despair, this is the prophet speaking, which presumably is Jeremiah, the prophet still clings to hope in God after all that. So as you're reading through this, remember that it takes a little turn here in chapter 3. And the advice given is patience for those suffering for no reason. Jeremiah had only ever done what God told him to do, and he got nothing but grief for it, and it seemed even like God himself was punishing him. But the point is, it's easy to have faith when things go well. But faith is only truly tested when it seems that God is far away and that God is against us. Then our faith is tested. Do we still have faith when that seems to be the case? As Christians, our faith must be rooted in an unchangeable fact of history, that Jesus rose from the dead. If it's based on anything else, such as experiences or feelings, it will fail when we need it most, when times like these come. And of course, it's not just faith in a fact, it's faith in the person that fact is about, and that this person is God, and then there will be heaven to look forward to if we're truly saved, which is to say we accepted this fact as true, that he rose from the dead, and we're trusting him to reconcile us to God. That's how you get to heaven. It's trust in the risen Jesus. No other Jesus and no other trust, no other object of trust, including our own experiences. Because that will never change. If you believe this as a fact and you accepted it, not only will that never change, but you got the Holy Spirit, the New Testament tells us, the moment you believed, as a deposit guaranteeing our inheritance. But that's a topic for another day, the guarantee of salvation. But the point is, where is your faith anchored? If people in the Old Testament could retain their faith in the midst of such dire circumstances going on for a lifetime, then what excuse do we have to give up so easily? That's the point, and I think the lesson we can draw from Lamentations. But one more point I need to make is that we must also be careful not to ascribe to Satan the acts of God, which, as Jesus said in Matthew 12:31 and 32, is an unforgivable sin. The people of Judah had called Jeremiah a traitor for speaking of God's judgment of their sins, but Christians today often do the same thing. Any diversion from their opinions is deemed satanic, not just disagreement, not just misguided or misunderstood, but satanic. When you take that step, that is slander against fellow believers and the Holy Spirit who indwells them. The descriptions of judgment in this book in Jeremiah should serve as warnings to us today not to do as they did, but we do it all the time. I had that experience just today in a Christian hangout where I posted a link that supplemented the material being spoken about on the video, and the video speakers immediately said that's Satan trying to distract us from the message. That is blasphemy. That is ascribing to Satan the things of God. So when Christians do that today, they're even worse than the people of Judah and Israel, who had warning after warning and punishment after punishment, and it did them no good whatsoever. They kept on doing what they shouldn't do, and we're no better. So that's about all I can draw from Lamentations, other than if you want to read funeral dirges, this is the place to go. And they're the only, like I said, the only real lesson in it, the uplifting thing, is that this, if we heed this warning, we won't suffer the same kind of punishments from God. And that's not to say that if we do suffer, that it must be punishment from God. We remember the book of Job, that sometimes God is showing somebody else a lesson. Either way, the point is, base your faith on the risen Jesus, and you're trusting him to reconcile you to God, and you're grateful for what he did. If you just hang on to those three things, you will reach heaven because you will be truly saved. Because that's what salvation is. So that's it for Lamentations.